I want to tell you something honestly, and I want to say it without jokes, without punchlines, without the shield I usually hide behind, because some things in life don't come to you as material, they come to you as weight. And Islam came to me like weight, not pressure, not force, not persuasion, but weight. The kind that settles in your chest when you suddenly realize that the way you've been thinking about life and death might be incomplete, maybe even childish. Because I grew up like a lot of people where death was either ignored or laughed at or turned into a philosophical shrug like, yeah, we all die. What are you going to do? Crack a beer and move on. And that works until it doesn't, until you start noticing that time isn't just moving forward. It's subtracting. It's taking pieces. Faces disappear, voices go quiet, people who once filled rooms become photographs, and you realize you've been joking your way through something that demands seriousness. And Islam doesn't let you joke your way through death. Islam doesn't let you pretend it's just a biological shutdown. Islam looks you straight in the eye and says, this matters. Your life matters. Your intentions matter. Your actions echo. And when I first encountered that idea, really encountered it, not through headlines or stereotypes or political noise, but through actual teachings, through the concept of accountability, it shook me because I wasn't raised with accountability beyond social consequences, beyond embarrassment or applause. But Islam introduces this idea that nothing disappears, that even the things nobody saw were still seen. And that's terrifying and comforting at the same time. Terrifying because you can't hide, comforting because nothing good is wasted, and suddenly life doesn't feel random anymore. It feels intentional. And that word intentional kept coming back to me because everything in Islam seems intentional. Waking up, eating, speaking, even silence has intention. And I realized how much of my life had been accidental, drifting, reacting, surviving on cleverness instead of purpose. And Islam doesn't really care how clever you are. It cares how sincere you are. And sincerity is not a currency we reward much anymore. We reward speed, outrage, entertainment. But Islam slows you down and asks, who are you when nobody's clapping? Who are you when it's just you and your conscience? And then it adds another layer, not just conscience, but accountability to God. And that concept of God in Islam isn't abstract. It's not distant. It's not a metaphor. It's direct, singular, absolute. And that alone rearranged my thinking, because a single source of truth removes excuses, removes the ability to say, well, everyone's got their own version. Islam says, no, truth exists whether you like it or not, whether you benefit from it or not. And that idea offended my modern sensibilities at first, because we love customization. We love tailoring reality to our comfort, but Islam doesn't tailor itself to you. It asks you to rise to it. And then there's death, the thing I avoided thinking about deeply for most of my life. Islam doesn't avoid it. It prepares you for it, not in a morbid way, but in a practical way, like packing for a journey you know is coming, and suddenly death isn't this chaotic cliff you fall off. It's a transition, a return. And when I read about the idea that life is a test, not a performance, not a competition, but a test, something in me relaxed, because tests explain struggle. They explain unfairness. They explain why good people suffer and bad people sometimes seem to win, because a test isn't about comfort, it's about response. And Islam puts enormous weight on response, patience, gratitude, humility. And I started seeing how much of my identity was built, resistance to humility. Because humility means admitting you don't run the universe. And comedians especially, we like control, we like being the smartest person in the room. But Islam says intelligence without humility is incomplete. And that was a hard pill to swallow, but once swallowed, it clarified things. Because if life is temporary, if death is certain, and if accountability is real, then suddenly petty things shrink, ego shrinks, grudges feel stupid, and kindness stops being optional. It becomes logical. And I noticed something else. Islam doesn't just talk about belief, it talks about behavior. You can't just think your way into righteousness. You have to act your way into it. And action shapes the soul, not the other way around. And that challenged my Western idea that thoughts are everything. Islam says no. Discipline creates clarity, not clarity creates discipline. And then there's the idea of intention, that actions are judged by intention. And that alone rewired how I see life, because intention gives dignity to ordinary moments. It means even small acts matter if the intention is sincere. And suddenly life isn't about grand achievements. It's about alignment between what you believe, what you say, and what you do. And death then becomes a mirror, not an end, a mirror that reflects whether you lived aligned or fractured. And Islam doesn't sugarcoat that mirror, but it also doesn't remove hope. Repentance is always open. Mercy is always larger than failure. And that balance between justice and mercy is something I didn't realize I was missing, because modern life swings between extremes, either harsh judgment or total moral relativism. Islam sits in this uncomfortable middle where responsibility exists but mercy dominates. And that middle space is where maturity lives. And I realized I spent a lot of time critiquing religion from the outside without ever letting it critique me. And Islam critiques you gently sometimes, firmly other times, but always with the assumption that you are capable of better. And that belief in human capacity is powerful because it doesn't infantilize you, it challenges you. And death then becomes not a punishment, but a meeting with the truth of who you were. And when you live with that awareness, life sharpens, moments gain clarity, time feels precious, not because you're afraid of losing it, but because you understand its purpose. And Islam gave me language for something I felt but couldn't articulate, that life is not owned, it's entrusted, and death is when the trust is returned. And once you see it that way, fear changes shape. It's no longer fear of disappearance, it's concern for integrity, concern for whether you honored what was given to you. And that concern doesn't paralyze, it focuses. And I started noticing how Islam emphasizes remembrance of God, remembrance of death, not to depress you, but to wake you up. And waking up is uncomfortable, but it's better than sleepwalking through existence. And maybe that's the biggest shift for me. Islam didn't give me answers that shut down curiosity. It gave me a framework that made questions meaningful. It didn't tell me to stop thinking. It told me to think with humility. And that's a rare instruction. And I'm not standing here claiming perfection or arrival. I'm standing here acknowledging impact, acknowledging that my view of life as a series of jokes punctuated by tragedy was incomplete. And Islam introduced coherence between birth and death, between effort and outcome, between seen and unseen. And once you see coherence, chaos loses its grip and death stops being the enemy. It becomes the boundary that gives life its shape. And that realization doesn't make you somber. It makes you serious in the best way. Serious about kindness. Serious about honesty. Serious about how you treat people when there's nothing to gain. And if that's not a transformation, I don't know what is. And as that understanding settled in me, I started realizing that Islam doesn't just change how you think about death. It changes how you sit with silence. Because silence in Islam isn't empty. It's filled with awareness. And awareness is something I had been avoiding my whole life by filling every gap with noise, with commentary, with jokes, with opinions. But Islam has this way of pulling the volume down so you can hear your own inner condition. And once you hear it, you can't pretend anymore. You start noticing how much of modern life is built on distraction, not fulfillment, and how distraction is really just fear dressed up as entertainment, fear of stillness, fear of meaning, fear of being measured by something beyond popularity or success. And Islam introduces this idea that the measure already exists, whether you acknowledge it or not. And that idea is sobering because it removes the illusion of escape, but it also removes the burden of confusion. Because when you know the rules of the game, you stop panicking about the scoreboard. And that's when I started noticing how Islam frames life not as something to conquer, but something to navigate with discipline. And discipline is not a word people like anymore. We associate it with restriction. But Islam reframes discipline as liberation. Liberation from impulse, from ego, from the constant hunger for validation. And when you understand that, death stops being the great interruption and becomes the completion of a process. And that terrified me at first because it forced me to ask whether I was actually becoming anything or just aging. And aging is automatic, but becoming is intentional. And Islam insists on becoming it in. Insists that your character matters more than your reputation, that your private self matters more than your public image. And once that clicks, life rearranges itself. Priorities shift without effort. You don't have to force meaning. Meaning starts demanding you. And death then becomes the moment when all the pretending falls away, when the layers peel back and only substance remains. And that image haunted me in a productive way, not with dread, but with clarity. because clarity is what I had been missing. Clarity about why morality exists, why suffering exists, why restraint exists. And Islam doesn't pretend these questions are easy. It just refuses to pretend they're meaningless. And that refusal alone feels radical in a culture that explains everything except purpose. And then there's the idea of return, that we come from God and to God we return. And that phrase hit me harder than I expected, because return implies origin, and origin implies intention, and intention implies care, and care implies that existence is not an accident. And if existence is not an accident, then neither is your life. And once you accept that, even partially, life feels heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier because responsibility enters the room, lighter because randomness leaves. And Islam doesn't offer comfort by denying pain. It offers comfort by contextualizing it, by saying, this is not forever, this is not the final word, this is not the whole story. And that perspective changes how you endure hardship, because endurance becomes meaningful. Patience becomes an act of intelligence rather than passivity. And death then becomes the point where endurance is rewarded, not erased. And I realized how often I confused cynicism with wisdom, how often I treated detachment as maturity, when in reality, it was just emotional avoidance. And Islam doesn't allow emotional avoidance. It demands presence, presence in joy, presence in grief, presence in accountability. And presence is uncomfortable, but it's also honest. And honesty is something Islam treats as sacred, not optional. And that emphasis on truthfulness, not just in speech, but in being, made me re-examine how often I had negotiated with my own conscience, how often I had justified things because they were socially acceptable or personally convenient. And Islam removes that safety net. It doesn't care what's trending. It cares what's true. And when truth becomes central, death stops being terrifying, because terror thrives on uncertainty. And Islam replaces uncertainty with certainty, not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about meaning. And that distinction matters, because you're not promised ease, you're promised significance, and significance is enough. And maybe that's why Islam affected my view of life so deeply, because it refuses to flatter you. It respects you enough to challenge you. And in a strange way, that respect feels like compassion, because being taken seriously is a form of mercy. And once you feel that, once you realize your life is being taken seriously by the universe, by God, by reality itself, you stop wasting time pretending that nothing matters. And death then becomes the final confirmation that everything mattered, that every choice contributed to the person you became. And when you live with that awareness, life stops being about survival and starts being about stewardship, stewardship of time, of character, of influence. And that shift doesn't make you rigid, it makes you deliberate. And deliberateness is rare, and rare things feel powerful. And I think that's what Islam ultimately did to my view of life and death. It didn't make me afraid of dying. It made me concerned about living correctly. And that concern, that quiet internal calibration, that's not fear, that's respect. Respect for existence, respect for truth, respect for the fact that one day the noise stops and meaning speaks. And when that day comes, I want to be someone who listened early,